leaching fraction. All we're talking about when we're saying the term leaching fraction is that we're going to measure the amount of water that leaches through a container with the canopy here, the amount of water that goes through the container and is collected. In this case, we've got a pot that is inside of another pot, but that bottom pot actually has a bag in it. And so what we've done during an irrigation, it can be one irrigation or it could be all the cycles that are done in a day. When we're talking about a leaching fraction, the amount of water that's in this plastic bag is what leached through the canopy and through the substrate and is now collected here in this plastic bag. So that is the leaching fraction, how much water that was applied, went through the canopy, went through the substrate, and is collected. To get a leaching fraction, to do a good job of comparison from that plant to that plant to that plant to that plant, we need to know how much water was applied. And you can actually figure out how much water was applied by having an empty bucket of the same size container as what your leaching fraction is. Because that, whatever that diameter of that container is, that's how much water is being applied for that area in the overhead irrigation bed. And so this is the amount of water that was applied if we just had an empty container for that area, for this size of container. Well, then that means we can measure this, and that's the water applied, and then we can measure this and we can figure out what percent leaching fraction we had. And in most cases, a good measure is that we want to be in a bark mix, and here at this nursery it was mentioned that they just use pine bark. It's a pine bark potting mix. Well, in a bark mix, you need to be somewhere probably 20% leaching fraction. In other words, you need 20% of the water that's applied coming through and going through the canopy and going through the substrate. Because if you don't get at least 20% in a bark mix, you may actually start developing hydrophobic conditions where the bark doesn't have enough water applied that it starts developing some dry areas. And then if you get into some dry areas, irrigation after irrigation, it just never gets re-wetted and you end up with this great big old dry pocket in the container. So usually it takes 20% for a bark mix. If you've got peat in there, maybe you can get away with 10 or 15%. And in a very controlled situation like in a greenhouse, there are some greenhouse operations that go to basically a zero. Just enough water to re-wet everything, and they'll do leaching fractions to see if they're getting just a little bit of water out, and that's where they want to be. So this is a means of measuring how efficient really you are with your irrigation. Now, usually nurseries are pretty good about their irrigation practices, and they're only going to have one kind of plant in a particular irrigation zone. Now, I say one kind of plant, I may be meaning there all conifers, or maybe it's all broadleaf evergreens, or maybe it's grasses, or maybe it's herbaceous perennials, something like that. We know that these two groups, all of these groups of plants are going to use less or different amounts of water. Perennials are going to use more water than a conifer does. And generally we don't put those in the same beds because the conifers will be real wet, stay too wet, and get into some possible root issues, and they just stay wet. Yet, if you were trying to make it work, the perennials would be too dry. And you know, sometimes I actually did get to nurseries where they were trying to grow a lot of different things in the same irrigation zone, and the best they could do would be to keep everybody unhappy. In other words, try to hit the middle of not keeping something that needed less water too wet and something that needed more water, not quite enough water, which then made it not grow as fast as it probably should because it was always running at a deficit. So one way to determine then whether things are getting the adequate amount of water is this thing called leaching fraction. But there's differences among each individual plant too. If you have a bed that's all broadleaf evergreens, you may have some broadleaf evergreens that have kind of a finer leaf, and in terms of, if you look at the architecture, there may be some broadleaf evergreens that actually have kind of an umbrella type of architecture, which may have that kind of effect where it basically sheds water. Once a plant gets beyond the edges of the container it usually has one of three effects. The canopy has one of three effects. Cotoneaster is one that we've measured with a fairly small leaf. Cotoneaster Skoghome, Damarai Skoghome, has a small leaf, and we've found that plant is neutral. Water goes through it, goes through the substrate, really doesn't change the leaching fraction. Whereas we've compared gardenia, it comes to mind. Vitex is another one that actually ends up being, once it gets beyond the edge of the container, it becomes a funnel. And in the same bed, when we were irrigating Cotoneaster and gardenia, the gardenia was gathering water, and we ended up with 200% more water in a leaching fraction than was in the empty container. And 200% more water in gardenias, that much extra water, they didn't look good, they weren't happy. And so sometimes you can check out why things aren't performing like they are, and particularly if you suspect that it's a water issue and it becomes a root issue because things are staying too wet. This is one way to kind of confirm it. But irrigation has more to do really with how plants grow than anything else you can come up with, mostly, because it's going to affect your controlled release fertilizer product. Even if your product is releasing like it's supposed to, if you're applying so much water that each time you irrigate it washes everything that's in all the pore space out, you're not going to have much for the plant to ever grab and take hold of. So it affects your slow release fertilizer program. If you have differences in potting mixes, if you bring stuff in and from one nursery to another nursery and it's all pine bark, and then we bring in some stuff that has some 10% peat moss in it, leaching fractions are going to be different because of the potting substrate too. Are they compatible? Well, we can wait around and see if the plants perform okay, or we could actually set up this little old thing we're doing here. This leaching fraction, we'd have a pretty good idea. If you got a whole bucket full of water that went through one plant and nothing coming through another, you know those two probably don't belong together. That's really not going to work. The other thing you can do is actually you can evaluate how uniform your irrigation blocks are. The further you get away from a riser may or may not have more or less water in it. And sometimes you can actually look at a bed and you can see growth kind of be big on the outside and kind of drop off in the center. That's probably a water distribution, water uniformity issue. And a lot of times we don't wade into the middle of the bed. We look at the edge of the bed and we say, well, these things are running dry, we need to irrigate more. And so again, the plants in the center have problems. So a leaching fraction can tell you a lot about your irrigation program. It can tell you about if it makes a difference if the risers are straight or not, or it can tell you how much uniformity you've got going diagonally across the block. If you put some pots, just empty pots here with a bag in them will work. And actually sometimes it's easier than that. A lot of these, there's 3-gallon containers, there's a paint bucket that fits them. We don't use too many 4-quart containers, but the small gallon buckets fit them tight, such that, you know, all of these bags in most cases are very tight against here, so we're not getting any outside water, so we've got a tight seal, and it works. Well, there are buckets that work for this too, and you only need, you know, a half dozen, maybe a dozen buckets to kind of occasionally go around the nursery if you see that you've got a problem or if it's something that's coming to mind. So this leaching fraction thing really isn't anything of, it's not a rocket science type of project. It's pretty easy to do, and it can tell you an awful lot about what's going on in your nursery. Let's do a little comparison here. So about 28 ounces, somewhere 28 ounces to 30 ounces, fluid ounces, is what the amount of water applied was for this size of container. So we're looking here at the azalea, and during the same irrigation cycle then, that the open container, the amount of water applied was 30 fluid ounces. We got 4 fluid ounces through the azalea. It's 12%. So, you know, we're probably, even the azalea probably got overwatered a little bit. So it's 12%, and we're looking for, say, for 10 to 20%. So it's in the range, but it's, you know, it could be a little more for the azalea. It's not quite 30, but we're probably at, what, 28, 26 fluid ounces. So we got about as much water coming through the arborvitae as we applied. You know, you can kind of work out in your mind, well, it didn't need as much water, so some more water went through. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. I'd have to work on that. But generally, we know that we'll probably need to apply less water for a conifer than we do to a broadleaf evergreen, and so it's showing that we had a bigger leaching fraction, more leaching fraction, and probably we're approaching 100% on that, or it's the same amount that went through the empty container. So obviously we just proved that these two don't belong in the same block. Now I'm thinking that grasses are going to need more water than a lot of things, but we got a goodly amount. And not quite as much. We're about 14 and 8, 22. So still a pretty high percentage, but and you know, we might actually get away with grasses and azalea from this one try, but you know, I might want more than one try to really decide if that's the case. Let's see what the rose did. Okay, we got 14. And 10. So 14 and 10, 24. So again, not so different than some of the other containers. So it's the azalea that was the least of anything. Maybe it was drier to begin with. You know, there's a lot of things that you can kind of perplex over, but at least we get an idea of how much water is going through each one of these. We know it's plenty. In most cases, we know that we probably could apply less water, or in the particular blocks that these plants came out of, those might be blocks that we could apply less water. Because we wouldn't normally have them in the same zone. Now we'll do the 1 gallons, of course, or the 3 quarts, and of course they were in the same zones as these, but they have less diameter. And I don't have the 3 quart to compare what my leaching fraction is, but so I'm not going to be able to make a good comparison here. But you got the same idea. You got the idea. Got this thrift or phlox here. And it didn't gather nearly as much, nearly 2 ounces. And we got a daylily. So in the 3 quarts, there's a difference. There's 8 ounces there. So again, just, you know, on a one try basis, they maybe don't belong together, and they probably might not be grown together. A lot of times those are high number items, and they'll have their own beds to themselves, their own zone to themselves possibly. But that's kind of the way that you can use a leaching fraction to check out whether, if you're looking for problems, whether the amount of water applied is going to be an issue, or it's a way to know if you're applying about the right amount of water. Because up to now, everybody knew that as plants grow, you needed to add time on your irrigation, right? But if you got a plant that's getting out over the size of the container and gathering 200% more water, guess what? You need to back off on the time you're running the irrigation because it's getting too wet. And that tells you plants with that funnel type of canopy need to be in zones by themselves. And you need to know what plants those are if you don't have enough for an entire zone, like gardenias and whatever else. So it's just a way of checking. It's a way for fertilizer people to know, you know, what might be, if you're not seeing a lot of response from your fertilizer, it could be the irrigation. So it's just a way for growers and various product reps to know a lot about what's going on, to provide some explanations on product.